This video essay discusses the impact of player agency, difficulty and play in the adventure game Return of the Obra Dinn designed by Lucas Pope. It also discusses the reasons for a proposed subcategory under which the game falls under the adventure game genre, the narrative jigsaw puzzle, and discusses a unique feature of the game under the subcategory which innovative story games can consider implementing to increase player agency. Adventure games are generally story-driven games which provide challenges to the player in the form of an unsolved puzzle that need to be solved to advance the narrative. Graphical adventure games such as Maniac Mansion, Secret of Monkey Island, and Grim Fandango were hit titles in this genre. Fernandez Vara defines adventure games as story-driven video games which encourage exploration and puzzle solving and always have at least one player character. The basic interaction of adventure games is based on object manipulation and spatial navigation. The challenges usually appear in the form of concatenated puzzles, which are integrated in the fictional world. Aaron Reed proposes that adventure games have a pyramid of elements: exploration, puzzles, and story. He suggests that connecting all three with narrative cohesion is very difficult as one is fundamentally in tension against the other two. We will discuss how Return of the Obra Dinn seems to be the exception to Reed's rule and also suggest an explanation for why this is so. In Return of the Obra Dinn, you are a chief inspector of insurance and claims from the East India Company, dispatched to assess the tragic events that occurred on Obra Dinn since it went missing in 1803 and subsequently washed up on port. Your goal is to determine the fate of the 60 crew and passengers who sailed on the ship, including their names, how they died, and where their location is should they be alive. At the start of the game, you find in your possession a logbook that includes a map of where the Obra Dinn may have travelled, the deck plans for the ship, the complete crew and passenger manifest, as well as sketches of the crew. You start with blank chapters and subchapters, which will fill up with details as you investigate. Investigation is conducted using a memento morum, a pocket watch which transports you to the moment of death of the corpse you're investigating. There's strong player agency in walking around exploring the details and mise-en-scène of Obra Dinn, both in the present and in the death scenes. Clues can be found everywhere in the game. Information in the logbook such as the deck plans, sketches, glossary of roles of the crew are all fair game for important clues. So are relationships between characters, their attire, their body language, speech and character actions all constitute important clues. With all this information, the player attempts to solve the puzzle of the fate and identity of each crew or passenger. For example, in the first flashback, we hear a mutineer demanding that the captain open the door. The captain shoots the mutineer, and we have the freedom to explore the mise-en-scène of this frozen moment. We find out that the scene is part 1 of the last chapter of the book. We later explore the captain's death scene where he asks for forgiveness to who seems to be his wife or lover, Abigail. He confesses that he shot Abigail's brother, who was also his friend. At this point, we can deduce from the first few death scenes we encountered that the Captain Robert Witherell committed suicide by shooting himself with a gun. Since he was skilled in combat, that provides also further evidence that he's the captain, and he was acknowledged by the first character that he was the captain. But who could possibly be the first character who died? We find the answer by first exploring Abigail's death scene. She's seen to be struck by the ship's rigging during a Kraken attack. A host of other characters are present in the scene. At this point, the player begins to get inundated with increasing amounts of information concerning the other crew and passengers on the ship. That aside, we can conclude the identity of the woman on the bed. It is Abigail, Captain Robert's wife, since her corpse was right beside Captain Robert when he made his last confession and killed himself, and her fate was that she was struck by the ship's rigging. To reinforce this deduction that Abigail is Robert's wife, we can also see that she's reposed in death right in the captain's quarters. As for the first character who was shot, we can deduce it is William Hoscott from a few pieces of information. He's dressed in an officer's jacket, denoting that he's probably a senior officer, perhaps the first, second, or third, or fourth mate. Since we also know that Robert killed Abigail's brother shortly before committing suicide and Abigail's middle name is Hoscott, we can see that William Hoscott is the second mate, and likely also Robert's best friend. We also see in the logbook sketches that he's standing right beside Robert and they are both wearing bicorn hats which indicate a naval officer's uniform. When the player identifies the fates of 3 people successfully in a logbook, the game will validate the player's conclusions. The narrative thus progresses due to the confirmation of the fates, so that the player can use this validated or confirmed information to deduce other fates with increased confidence. The gathering of information by the player is done in a non-linear fashion, and some important clues can only be picked up much later. The game is difficult and challenging in a realistic way. It requires players to take notes from observations and rely on their memory and logic, very much like Sherlock Holmes observing and putting together clues in a case. In many adventure games, the deductions can be somewhat random and even almost impossible to solve. It was even commonplace for players in the 80s to call tall numbers and pay for hints, or buy hint books to progress in the game. Even today, a minority of games sell hints to players for them to progress. Sony has even filed a patent that lets players buy hints for PlayStation users. The player's knowledge that the game's challenges are difficult yet realistic increases their sense of agency because some games simply are not realistically solved. For example, when I played King's Quest as a child, I had to type dive instead of tread water when the player character Graham was drowning in the well. According to Reed, strong pillars of exploration and story in classic adventure games reinforce the player's identity as the star on a hero's journey. This in turn increases the player's sense of agency, since the player controls the avatar and successful exploration drives the narrative forward. However, Reed asserts that removing one pillar will strengthen the promise of the opposite edge and weaken the dangers of the two connected edges. For example, to strengthen the player's agency in the story, Reed suggests removing puzzles as a pillar. In Return of the Obra Dinn, all of the three pillars of exploration, story, and puzzle solving seems to work hand in hand to advance the narrative. Since the whole game is ripe for exploration, the player exerts agency by choosing the order and level of attention he pays to detail. If he's OCD, for example, he will go through scenes again and again to extract clues, while another player might simply decide to solve the fates and identities much later. There's no specific order, and the player has increased agency in the order in which he deduces the fates. In this manner, a player's experience and perception of the narrative, including events, characters, and their relationships, can differ. It is also important to note that for selected crew and passengers, there are multiple correct answers. This is contrary to classical adventure games, where there's usually one correct answer. Guesswork and incomplete information is part of the game. Like a game of poker, the player makes the best decision he can based on what he has deduced from his observations. It is common for the player to guess wrongly, and this can trigger a chain reaction affecting his prior deductions if they have not been validated. In conclusion, two features differentiate Return of the Obra Dinn from classical titles in the adventure game genre. The first feature includes the concatenated narrative pieces that are progressively confirmed as the player successfully deduces or guesses fates in sets of three. By doing progressive confirmation, the player advances the narrative of the adventure game as suggested by Fernandez Vara. However, for many classical adventure games, this puzzle-solving process occurs as individual obstacles to advance the narrative. In Return of the Obra Dinn, however, these narrative pieces are concatenated into the entire game itself. Therefore, it is more akin to a narrative jigsaw, and it is the process of clue gathering and deduction that provides play and pleasure to the player. The second point is the game's design not just as a narrative jigsaw, but a partially subjective narrative jigsaw. A normal jigsaw has pieces which fit exclusively to each other, much like a classical adventure game where there's a specific answer to every solution. However, in Return of the Obra Dinn, some pieces of this jigsaw are neutral due to incomplete information. Thus, the player's agency in solving the puzzle is also not completely determined by the designer, and from this, the player is empowered with his increased agency in answering certain puzzles subjectively and coming to his own conclusions in the events that transpired. On a side note, Pope, the game designer, also brilliantly constructs the detailed death scenes in an episodic-like manner from a TV series. The player sees a few key dramatic events in each episode of the TV series and engages in play by exploring a moment from these events in detail in an attempt to figure out the jigsaw puzzle. It may be sort of like watching random key scenes in a non-chronological order from The Walking Dead or Game of Thrones TV series and trying to connect the dots. Thanks for watching this video essay, and I hope you liked it.